Sit in the back of your coat on, Mr.
Okay. Yeah, Tom, one recipe.
Ready?
Gotta get them.
Now you gonna tell them about the haircut? You all together? We got the 2 for 1 today? Yeah.
He said that.
You are.
I guess I am.
Raise the popcorn. All right, come back here. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Most of you know who I am, but for the video, my name is Matt Green. I am the president of the local Federalist Society chapter here in Mobile. This is the Brevard and Alex Howard chapter. Tonight, we're very excited to have Mr. Quin Hillyer as our guest speaker. He'll be speaking tonight on a phenomenon known as over-criminalization of conduct and the over-federalization of crimes here in the United States. It is an epidemic in many aspects, in that it's many citizens unaware that they're committing any type of crimes, and I'll talk about citizens. The average citizen on the street who's never been in trouble in their life, who lives an exemplary life, service, and people that are not normally within the purview of criminal conduct, who by some obscure federal statute or regulation becomes ensnared in the criminal justice system. And we'll talk briefly tonight on 2 particular instances. In many ways, this touches on several facets of the Federalist Society, which are kind of hallmarks of our group. The Federalist Society is a nonpartisan, conservative, and libertarian organization. It's dedicated to freedom, federalism, and judicial restraint. The Federalist Society seeks to educate the legal community through its programs and publications about how limited constitutional government based on the rule of law can be a positive effect on law and public policy. Tonight, we're going to discuss 2 particular cases, one of which is, there are actually two cases are mentioned in the book that we've encouraged you to review and read. I've included one of the chapters in our handout. It's published by the Heritage Foundation. It's called One Nation Under Arrest. Mr. Quin Hillyer's published a story involving a very interesting gentleman who lived his whole life without ever being in trouble or getting arrested or violating any criminal law, but based on some obscure federal statute and an executive regulatory agency found himself ensnared in a horrible and gross abuse of power and injustice, and he'll go into greater detail about that. It should be very interesting. Right now, as we speak, the United States Code has about over 4,450 different offenses, criminal offenses. The Code of Federal Regulations right now literally has tens of thousands of regulations that are treated or enforced with criminal penalties. You couple that with the fact that Congress has advocated its role in many instances to federal regulatory agencies. Right now, these federal regulatory agencies have rulemaking power and can penalize criminally certain conduct. And there's certain estimates right now that there are over 300,000 regulatory offenses created by these agencies that many of us here probably have no idea, and I'm certain the average citizen has no idea what they are. And you'll hear about 2 of those instances tonight. There's also the growing phenomenon in the criminal justice system, especially in the federal system, the evisceration of the mens rea requirement, and there's a growing, trend in federal legislation, federal penal legislation, that completely does away with that cornerstone of American criminal justice. It's been, we focus on the procedural aspects of defendants' rights, Miranda, the right to counsel. But in many instances, this is probably the most dangerous form of government abuse when crimes and statutes are passed that completely, and when I say mens rea, I mean the criminal intent, the knowledge that you're committing a crime, they completely do away with it. And it's oftentimes resulted in travesties of justice. We'll focus, I know Mr. Hillyer will focus on one particular case here that happened in the Southern District. It's called the Lobster case. It's the United States versus McNabb. We'll go into a little greater detail about that as well. He'll also talk about Krister Everston, and he's written a chapter, as I said, it's called Krister's Story. And you'll hear of an obscure federal law called RCRA, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, and how that particular act resulted in a travesty of justice in Mr. Christopher's case. Otherwise law-abiding citizen is surrounded by a black Suburban, forced him off the road, SWAT members in uniform take him out of his car, and all because he failed to put a proper label on a package he put in the U.S. mail. These and other materials I've included in the handout for you tonight to take a look at. I know Congress, I think the House Subcommittee on the Judiciary has held several hearings on this phenomenon, and it's really a nonpartisan issue, or excuse me, a bipartisan issue. I say that because you have members of both the Republican and Democratic Party outraged and concerned with this growing trend. As I said, how average, normal, otherwise law-abiding citizens become ensnared in this particular trap, so to speak. Briefly, what I'll do is I'm going to show you about a 4-minute clip that the Heritage Foundation did focusing on Quin's story about Mr. Everston, and then I'll turn the floor over to him.
They're behind the doors, they're aiming all these machine guns at me, and they're wearing black helmets with visors. You can't see, just black, everything's black, bulletproof vests, everything. And then that's where my nightmare started. I said, what label? I told the FBI agents, I don't need a label. It's under 6.2 pounds. They said, oh, you need a label. I said, what label? I haven't even seen a label. I don't even know about a label. I asked him, what is the right way to pack it? And the FBI agent said, I don't know. All they needed to do was knock on my door and say, hey, we think you need this label. And they could have given me a stack of labels or 2 labels or whatever, or they could have told me, get your labels wherever, and I would have been happy to do it. But no, they didn't do that. I got a call from my public defender in Alaska, and he said, oh, we heard that you've been indicted for a garbage permit. And I said, garbage permit? What is that? What garbage? And he said, oh, the EPA, they said that you had garbage working on your invention, and there's a law called RCRA. I said, what's RCRA? I've never heard of RCRA. They took everything. There was nothing left. In my trial, they gave me all their bills to destroy everything. It was something like $421,050, something like that. And everything was brand new, and it only cost $100,000 to buy it. And I thought, Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, I can never get past that. Brand new resources, they destroyed. They didn't even do RCRA. I hope in my heart that the EPA acted. I mean, I don't think they're wrong, But I think they didn't, I would hope they didn't understand what they were doing because RCRA is so complicated. And I don't even think the EPA people understand RCRA.
Quin Hillyer is a senior fellow for the Center for Individual Freedom. He's a senior editor also for the American Spectator magazine, and he's also a writer in residence at the University of Mobile. He has won mainstream awards for journalistic excellence at the local, state, regional, and national levels. He has been published professionally in over 50 publications, including the Wall Street Journal, the San Francisco Chronicle, the Washington Post, the National Review, Weekly Standard, Human Events, and the list goes on and on. He's also a former editorial writer and columnist for the Washington Times. And the Washington Examiner, and with our own Mobile Register. He also has written for the Arkansas Democrat Gazette, and he's also a former managing editor of Gambit Weekly in New Orleans. He has appeared dozens of times as a television analyst in Washington, D.C., Alabama, Arkansas, and Louisiana, and also as a guest many hundreds of times on national and local radio shows. He has worked in professional or volunteer capacities in dozens of political campaigns and served for 5 years as a press secretary for Bob Livingston, United States House Appropriations Committee chairman from the state of Louisiana. He was an original executive board member of the internationally acclaimed Louisiana Coalition against racism and Nazism, formed to halt the then New York political rise of former KKK leader David Duke. Hillyer has also volunteered in leadership roles for numerous church, civic, and educational organizations. He graduated with honors from Georgetown University and is also a fellow of Loyola University in New Orleans, Institute of Politics and of Leadership, Coastal Alabama. He is married to the former Therese Robinson of Mobile. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Quin Hillyer.
Really appreciate that. Thank you, Matt Green. Thank you, Tom Walsh, for calling me, and to all of you for having me here. I'm particularly fond of the Federalist Society. When Bill Pryor started the Tulane chapter in the mid-1980s, my father was one of the original established attorney sponsors of the chapter. The Federalist beachhead at Tulane's liberal law school was something that made my father very happy. The Tulane fight song's main refrain is a one, a two, a hell of a hullabaloo. And the Federalist Society has been causing a hell of a hullabaloo, a wonderful hullabaloo, throughout the national liberal legal community ever since it was founded more than a quarter century ago. And speaking of a hullabaloo, which Webster defines as a confused noise or an uproar, it all seemed like a needless hullabaloo about next to nothing back in 1999 when the Mobile Register ran a story about a strange arrest. The official defendants were, according to the arrest record, 70,787 and 8/10 pounds of spiny lobster tails contained in 999 plastic bags.
At the age of 64, Abner Schoenwetter is trying to start his life over again. After 12 years in a highly competitive industry, his partnership involving this Honduran seafood processing warehouse had made him one of Florida's most successful seafood importers. So how is it that this hard-working businessman with no criminal history became a convicted felon, sentenced to over 8 years in federal prison? Abner's troubles began when federal agents seized a routine shipment of Caribbean lobsters that he had purchased from a Honduran fisherman, David Henson McNabb.
Henson McNabb's boat came in with a shipment of 70,000 pounds of lobster tails. all of a sudden the National Marine Fisheries Service and Customs showed up. And we had already cleared Customs and FDA for that particular load on the water, which was normal. They stopped us and they said, "We don't know why we're stopping you, but we were ordered to stop you. Now put the product back in the container." We have a pretty good idea that the anonymous fax was sent by one of our competitors. This last particular shipment was one of the hardest ones we had, where the bidding went on for a while, and in fact we got to a point where we almost were going to turn it down. We were always in competition, every shipment, to buy Henson McNabb's product.
As this document prepared by the Department of Commerce shows, Abby and Henson McNabb were cited for shipping the product in the clear plastic bags they had always used, instead of cardboard containers, supposedly required by Honduran regulations. Investigators also charged them with mixing undersized lobster tails within the rest of the shipment, an accusation contained in the anonymous fax. Initially, the seizure was considered an annoyance, a civil matter at worst. But as it turned out, the federal government had been building a criminal case against Abby for quite some time.
We came to find out that the government had already sent investigators 2 or 3 times to Honduras prior to them even processing McNabb's product. And they were developing a criminal case against us, even when they were declaring that it was only a civil matter. So we were unprepared for what came afterward. I get a call at 7 in the morning and somebody on the other end says, "Mr. Schoenwetter, this is the FBI, come to the front door." And I come to the front door and there's about 13 representatives of the FBI, the IRS, National Marine Fisheries Service, Customs, all with guns.
Prosecutors eventually brought criminal charges against Abby under a law called the Lacey Act.
The Lacey Act says, I don't quote it, but it says that basically if you violate the wildlife laws of another country, then the United States can prosecute you in this country. So they picked out these 3 wildlife regulations, which were Honduran regulations, and charged us with violating them. And in turn became Lacey Act violations, which they were also to include smuggling into and conspiracy and in the end money laundering.
Basing their case on arcane Honduran laws, government prosecutors pressed Abby to plead guilty. Because he hadn't done anything he knew was wrong or illegal, Abby chose to fight the charges in court. The Attorney General of Honduras came to his defense, submitting this letter to the court, stating that U.S. prosecutors had, quote, deemed as valid laws that the government of Honduras has determined not to be applicable to the case, unquote.
Not only didn't we know anything about these regulations, but as it turned out, the government of Honduras said that the regulations in question at the time of the supposed crime didn't exist or were null and void.
Despite the Honduran government's written certification that the U.S. government was prosecuting Abby under invalid Honduran laws, the case continued. In the years that followed, the Federal Court of Appeals in Atlanta upheld Abby's conviction, and the Supreme Court refused to hear his case. His appeals exhausted, Abby began his 8-year sentence at the federal prison in Estill, South Carolina.
I never knew what the worst thing in life was. You know, things happen to people. But in my mind now, the worst thing that anybody can do to you is take away your freedom. All in all, it destroyed the health of the family and the financial ability of the family to go, you know, to just live a normal life. to be tried and convicted and spend so many years in prison because you supposedly violated a regulation in another country, if somebody told me that could happen to me, I would have bet them $1 million that never could happen in this country. How could they put you in prison for something like that?
Do many, I don't want to go way into the details of this case if y'all know a lot about it. Do many of y'all remember this case? Vaguely. Only vaguely, good. Well, reporter Mike Wilson noted in the Register, and I quote, "The lobsters were arrested April 5th at 1:50 p.m. without incident. The defendants have proved mild prisoners, detained at -8 degrees Fahrenheit at CS Integrated Incorporated, a storage facility in Berkeley Field. 11 days after their arrest, the lobsters got a lawyer." End quote. It all sounds sort of funny, but it was anything but a joke. Because the lobster tails had been packed in plastic instead of cardboard, 3 men each spent 8 years. 8 years in federal prison, all for supposedly violating laws not even promulgated in the United States, but in Honduras. Not even famed Honduran-American lawyer Miguel Estrada, a favorite of the Federalist Society, could get the convictions thrown out. I'll talk more about this case in a little while, but I begin with it right now as an examples of the absurdities of a combination of A, some federal prosecutors run amok, and B, the absurdities of the Federal Criminal Code. If you can call it a code at all. It's more like what's described in the title of, there was a Newbery Award-winning children's book from way back when. It was called The Mixed Up Files of Mrs. Basil Lee Frankweiler. And that's what the Federal Criminal Code is like. The federal government was designed to have extremely limited police powers. You all know that. Most of the police powers belong to the states and the local government. Yet former Attorney General Dick Thornburgh reports that by one estimate, there are 4,450 federal criminal laws on the books. And that understates the true nature of the problem. As Matt said, there are more than 300,000 individual federal regulations that each may be enforced criminally. Federal criminal law is a mess. It makes no sense. It's outrageously punitive. It is ripe for, it's frequently marred by extreme and indefensible abuses of justice. Now, the problem isn't only federal. It can be state and local too. Grandmothers jailed for not trimming hedges. Students arrested, criminally charged, when kitchen knives were found behind the seat of pickup trucks after a box spill during a move from one apartment to another. And while not criminal, the same general idea applies about twice a year when somewhere in the country you get a news story about a child fined for an illegal lemonade stand. The problem, as Matt said, is called over-criminalization. And the large coalition across ideological lines led by the Heritage Foundation and the ACLU, nice broad spectrum, has been working together in a project, so far with little success, to combat it. Here's the problem. Matt, you're a felon. Tom, you're a felon. Judge Johnson, you're a felon. All of you are felons, and so am I. At least, that's what noted defense attorney Harvey Silverglate says in a book called 3 Felonies a Day, describing how every single American commits, on average, 3 felonies a day without a single clue that they're doing anything wrong. No clue, no intent, no mens rea. I don't want to address everything, or endorsed everything in Silverglade's book. He seems already to have adjudged Don Siegelman innocent, for example. And my former colleague Eddie Curran assures me that isn't the case. But Silverglade's main point is absolutely right. With so many regulations carrying criminal penalties and with so much discretionary power handed to federal prosecutors, the feds could probably put anybody in jail that they want to. And sometimes they do, for no good reason. Star Chamber, Mead, Franz Kafka. For example, let us return to the lobster case, which I dubbed crustacean frustration. I know some of you have, well, seen the book, One Nation Under Arrest. I've got a copy of it here that the video talked about. This case is highlighted, and for which I wrote the chapter on Christopher Evertson too. But I did a column on the lobster case long before the book came out. So let me briefly reset the scene. The feds seized the lobsters. They were caught in Honduran waters, brought into Bayou Battery. They seized the lobsters on suspicion that they were too short and thus too young, in supposed contradiction of Honduran law, trying to protect the species. And Honduran law is applied to U.S. law through what I think is the idiotic Lacey Act. Well, it turned out that well under 5% of the tails were too short, clearly in the realm of unintentional error. Again, what was it? 70,700 pounds, of which 3,000 or so pounds were too short. Anyway, even though it was only a tiny amount, therefore obvious, just mere error, all of the lobster was packed in plastic, and the feds interpreted Honduran law to say that it should be in cardboard. That made it not just a minor amount of goods that were brought in illegally, but a massive amount, because it was all illegal. It was all in plastic, Lord forbid. And now to quote my column from the Washington Examiner, and if it were an illegal import, well, that made it smuggling, right? And if the importers used the money they earned to buy any goods in the United States, well, that turned the case into money laundering. Suddenly, the allegation of minor civil violations became a major criminal case. The defendants were given the sentences I told you about of 8 years each in federal prison to enforce a federal regulation about undersized lobsters. Never mind, get this, that the importers openly took the lobsters through customs, seemingly unaware that they were doing anything wrong. Never mind that the U.S. Department of Commerce published an official price list for Honduran lobsters of the very sizes supposedly outlawed. None of that mattered. The amazing coda to this case is that at first, the Honduran Attorney General and then the President of Honduras wrote to the feds to say the Honduran law in question had been repealed 4 years before the case began. We were looking at an out-of-date Honduran code. So not only had the importers not violated any other American laws, but they hadn't violated Honduran law either. Miguel Estrada took up the case, but to no avail. The 3 lobstermen, one of them a Honduran national named David McNabb, served 8 years in a federal pen for violating a law of a foreign country that was not even a law when they violated it. This is sickening. This is not the America I know and love. If I were Rick Santorum, I'd say this case upset me so much it made me want to throw up. But then the media would start questioning my temperament, so maybe I shouldn't say that. But this case happened right here in Mobile County, but banana republics do justice better than this. And the next case I'll use, I didn't know you were going to show the film, but it's the case of Kirster Evertson. Now, I wrote a 4-part series about his case before I turned that into a book chapter for Heritage. But did you all read? I know he made y'all aware of this before I came. Did y'all actually read the chapter? Because I don't, all of you, or just raise your hands if you did. Only a couple? Okay, good. Then I will go on. Here's the deal. Kirsten Evertson is one of these dreamers with real good scientific ability, and that was his life. In junior high school, he came in third. He was in Hawaii at the time in a state high school contest, but he was in junior high. Came in third for his science project, creating electricity from the main ingredient that he used was coconut milk. He had this dream all along of creating an environmentally safe fuel cell that didn't burn carbon, et cetera, et cetera. And that was his dream for his whole life. And you saw him. He's a very gentle man. He's got a stutter. He had a long record of volunteer work with at-risk kids and with just wonderful human being. Never in trouble with the law before. Well, he was working on making a mass-produced fuel cell, mixing raw sodium with borax. You know, lemon borax that you use in detergent, laundry detergent. Raw sodium, if mixed with the right amount of water, can explode. So it can be dangerous. So you have to pack it right. Well, anyway, he was working on this case, and he knew all about the properties of raw sodium, and theoretically everybody, all the scientists say, yes, indeed, if you create the right conditions, you can create electricity from this combination of sodium with borax. So the only question is whether you can do it in a form that can be mass-produced and can actually be useful. So that's what he was trying to do, and he spent years, and basically all of it, he got an inheritance. He spent an inheritance of $100,000, all to try to make this work. And he almost got it, but he didn't quite get it, and he ran out of money. So he carefully stored it, all the materials in steel drums, packed with a layer of oil. I mean, just went to the nth degree to make it safe. Transported it a half a mile down the road to basically an auto storage and supply yard, where the guy agreed to take it, and left it there so he was in Idaho, so he could go to Alaska. And the other love of his life was gold mining in Alaska rivers, and his mother lived in Wasilla. So he was going to try to find some gold and raise some more money. And as he was there, he brought some of the sodium with him because it's valuable on the market. You can sell it on eBay as long as you pack it correctly. So as he's trying to raise money for his gold expedition, he sold we sold a small amount of the raw sodium on eBay. Got bought. He packaged it according to every regulation, took it to UPS, put the correct instructions saying you should not send it by air, because since it is technically an explosive, the law says you can't do it by air because you could blow, So he put that on the instructions, but he put the instructions on the wrong label. Why was it the wrong label? Because he didn't know. He put it for ground transportation via UPS. He didn't know that from Alaska, UPS doesn't have ground transportation. They only fly. He didn't know that. So he goes about his business, having labeled it right, having packaged it right. Nobody says it was unsafe. And next thing you know, he's driving down the road. Black SUV comes, pushes him off the side of the road, spread eagle, face down, guns at his head, as if he's a terrorist. So you saw what happened then. It took 2 years. A jury finally cleared him figured out, okay, he's over it. Well, while he was in there, they were saying, well, what did you do, while he was waiting trial, what were you doing with the sodium? And he told them, well, I've got a whole lot, thousands of other pounds of it, packaged at this storage place in Idaho, because I'm going to go back there and I'm going to keep working on this fuel cell. Feds don't like having juries say they're wrong. They went to the EPA and said, this is a hazardous substance. And the law says you may not dispose of a hazardous substance under the wrong conditions. Well, he hadn't disposed of it. To dispose it, you had to have abandoned it. He clearly expressed his interest in going back. That's why he had stored it so carefully. The guy that he stored it with had been told he was coming back. So he didn't abandon it, it didn't matter. They told him he illegally disposed of something he didn't dispose of, and that what he disposed that he didn't dispose of was a hazardous material, even though the way that it was packed would not have been hazardous for 500, 1,000, 2,000 years. It was only hazardous if you took it out of its packaging and left it outside in the rain, in which case it would then explode. That's what they convicted him of, is illegally disposing of a hazardous material that he didn't dispose of that wasn't hazardous. I've talked to Kirster Evertson on the phone. We've seen him, wonderful man, served 13 months in jail, another 8 months in a halfway house. All of his $100,000 worth of material was destroyed at a cost of $434,000. And he said, if they wanted to destroy it, I didn't want to destroy it. If they told me they were going to destroy it, that they had to destroy it, I could have told them how to do it for about $250. Anyway, it's very upsetting to see cases like these. Unfortunately, they are actually not all that rare. I might tread on some tough ground here, or maybe unpopular ground, but how many of you have heard of Conrad Black? The media mogul, respected historian, who was also put into the federal pen on what some people call questionable charges. Anyway, about a month ago, Black wrote a piece for the Huffington Post in which he took up the case of one Stephen Nodine, citing and echoing an article that I did on Nodine. Now, just because Nodine is a skank doesn't mean he's a dangerous, violent drug dealer. But the federal gun case against him, I don't know anything about the murder case. Don't know whether he killed that poor girl or not. But the federal gun case against him used a law meant to snare violent drug gangs. It was never intended for somebody overusing perfectly legal prescription drugs who happened to have a handgun in his closet. They used it to put the man in prison. This, I thought, Conrad Black thought, other people are starting to look at this case, thought that the federal part of this, the federal case, was abusive. He shouldn't have been in. Now, Nodine got lucky in that he was in the same prison as Conrad Black, so he had somebody with the wherewithal of Conrad Black to start telling his story, and you're going to, I believe, see it on some national TV show soon. But that's another local example of the problem of either over-criminalization or prosecutorial abuse. I mean, you've heard of the case of Alaska Senator Ted Stevens, the horrible prosecutorial abuses there. Let me make this clear, I'm usually on the side of prosecutors. If I see somebody served as a U.S. attorney, assistant U.S. attorney, I'm inclined to think the best of him or her, and I'm usually right in thinking the best. They're putting the bad guys in jail. But I think, Heritage thinks, the ACLU think, a whole lot of the whole coalition, left, right, and center, are starting to think that prosecutors now, federal prosecutors, enjoy far too much discretionary power and some of them, or at least a few of them, misuse it. Of course, it doesn't start with the prosecutor. The problem is that Congress tries to pass a law to cure every perceived problem. Then, to show they mean business, they say, well, one of the ways to enforce it, they'll have a range, but they'll say it can be enforced with criminal penalties. So then they can't be bothered to define the details, so they leave the details to regulatory agencies. The agencies go hog wild, issuing far too many regulations to enforce the general intent of Congress. And then, with the leeway provided by Congress, they effectively attach criminal penalties to each of those regulations. That's how you get more than 300,000 federal regulations, each carrying criminal penalties, and why each of us is a felon 3 times over every day of our lives. It gets worse. The enforcement arms of those agencies often have armed agents. EPA, OSHA, Department of Health and Human Services, the Small Business Administration are among the dozen federal outfits that all have armed agents on the loose. And sometimes those armed agents, they like their power. Ever had an EPA agent or groups of 20 or 30 EPA agents who push overzealousness to the max? They swoop in, they terrorize Americans who aren't in the slightest bit dangerous. They probably have no idea they've even committed a civil violation, much less a crime. To quote another of my articles, consider the case of James Knott, owner of a small Massachusetts niche manufacturer that won awards specifically for developing pollution control technology. Again, this is a pro-environment manufacturer. Does pollution control technology, like Kirsten Everett. He's one of the good guys. In November of 1997, a SWAT team of 21 EPA agents, many of them armed, swooped in on the company's facility to conduct pH samplings of rinse water discharged into a public sewer. A year later, the U.S. attorney indicted Knott on 2 felony counts because a small volume of the rinse water supposedly was too acidic to meet regulations. No actual environmental harm was alleged, but the prosecution went forward anyway. Only during pretrial discovery did Knott's attorneys find that the original agent's reading showed the water not to be acidic. It had a neutral pH rather than an acidic one. But the report had been marked over to change the numerical reading. The charges were dropped, but not before Knott lost hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees and lost business. Money you can't get back. The judge, by the way, did admonish the EPA for an unconstitutional search of the plant. But again, most people don't have the resources to fight abuses like this. Most people are not like James Knott. They can't come out on top when the power of the federal government is used to run roughshod over their rights. Our civil liberties are not just at risk, they're being trampled. Now I'm going to make a little segue here and then I'll work toward the end, but for the most part I've concentrated on the problem of federal over-criminalization and the related problems of agency or prosecutorial abuse, often based on unwisely criminalized actions in the first place. But the problem's not only federal, more and more states and localities, often but not always using federal grants, are setting up special SWAT teams they use not just against suspects known to be violent, but in all sorts of circumstances, especially where illegal narcotics are supposedly involved. The problem is that many of these local SWAT teams, paid for by federal money, aren't well trained. A writer named Bradley Balco, who writes for a lot of libertarian outlets, specializes in highlighting the resulting abuses. Here's the most famous one. July 29, 2008. Drug runners delivered a large shipment of marijuana to the wrong address in Berlin Heights, Maryland. They left it on the doorstep. The idea was they had this scheme, they would send it via UPS or somebody, it would get left on the doorstep and then have somebody waiting once UPS drove off to pick it up the doorstep and go off with it. That's how they would transport it. By sheer happenstance, in this case, it was random address happened to be the house of the town's mayor, Shay Calvo. The mayor, though, was home when the package was delivered. He went out, picked it up from the doorstep, brought it inside, left it unopened on his dining room table, went upstairs to change for a formal event. Just in time for the SWAT team who were tracking the shipment to bust in on the mayor, who was upstairs changing clothes, and on his elderly mother-in-law downstairs. Automatic weapons drawn, face on the ground, spread eagle. Then handcuffed for hours, weren't told what it was about. Mayor in his underwear, handcuffed for hours. That's not the worst of it. Mayor and his wife had 2 pet Labradors. The SWAT team shot dead the 2 dogs. Later investigations proved that at least one of the dogs was actually running away from the officers when shot repeatedly. The mayor claimed that neither dog was threatening. He said neither dog charged. Nobody has testified that the dogs actually were charging. Didn't matter. Family pets, dead, multiple gunshots to each. To recap, wrong address, innocent mayor, innocent elderly lady, 2 very dead family pets. Still, the sheriff of Prince George's County, Maryland was unrepentant, even after it was determined conclusively that the mayor was a completely innocent victim. Quote, "We've apologized for the incident, but we will never apologize for taking drugs off our streets," the sheriff said. Quite frankly, we do it again, tonight. Obviously, something is seriously askew with our system of criminal justice. Now, I'll be the first one out of the blocks fighting against the practice of overturning otherwise valid convictions because of harmless police failure to tick off every single procedural point of a checklist according to Hoyle. That's not what this is about. This is about a radical failure to keep perspective, and it's mostly federal, on what is and isn't or should not be illegal. And especially the use of armed force by agents of agencies that probably shouldn't have any armed people at all, in upholding laws of dubious utility whose, quote, violators certainly have not the whiff of a violent or otherwise dangerous nature. Okay, that's enough for now. In our discussions, if you want, I'll be happy to discuss how and why I think the Justice Department under Eric Holder is particularly prone to these abuses and others. But for now, let me close by saying that if Martin Luther King was right that the arc of the moral universe bends toward justice, it certainly doesn't bend in the direction or in favor of the Justice Department in Washington, D.C. Thank you very much for forming a chapter of the Federalist Society to explore issues like these, and thank you very much for having me.
Anybody have any questions?
Quin, how do you square, which you and I believe, I'm actually doing a paper on this as well, look at my notes, this, I guess, idiotic philosophy, you'll see it right here. Oh, when is the state going to pass an anti-texting while driving ban? The citizens seem to want every kind of law that they think will protect them and fail to understand the proper role of government.
Lord only knows. I mean, everybody wants, certainly every politician wants to be tough on crime, because being tough on crime is rightly popular. You're tough on crime, you get the votes. And you should, if you're tough on things that actually are real crimes and that ought to be crimes. The problem is so many people or elected officials are so eager to prove that they're tough on crime that anytime they see a problem, they criminalize it. And it sounds good. Oh, I want to throw the book at the bad guys. And the public's living their own lives. They hear tough on crime, they like it. You know, throw the book at the bad guys, they like it. So until recently, there's been very little backlash against it. What Heritage and the ACLU and others are trying to do with this over-criminalization project is raise, and with the congressional hearings that they've had, is raise the public consciousness of cases like this, so that the public will start to say, wait a minute, you know, this isn't tough on crime, this is tough on me and my brother and my neighbor who aren't criminals. It's going to take a lot of work especially by people running for office who are willing to get out there and say that this is a problem. And I think you can. You don't have to make a speech as long as I did to throw out a few examples and say, I want to get tough on criminals, not tough on your neighbor who filled out the wrong packing slip. But it's going to take politicians with the guts to make the case, and then it's going to take the public to say, oh, yeah, that makes sense.
I have a comment and a question. One on what you're just talking about. The governor of New Mexico was running for
Gary Johnson.
He actually vetoed a bill, Republican back in New Mexico, where you had to. It was proposed that pet store owners had to walk their dogs for 2 hours. He vetoed it, basically saying, who the hell is going to enforce this law? They're going to be a cop that walks behind these people for 2 hours and time it. And that's kind of where it goes. He was actually someone who said, no, we're not going to do that. It's great. In theory, it sounds wonderful. Yeah, whatever, walk the dogs. But my comment or my question is, I don't know if there's maybe 40 sentencing guidelines on the lobster case, but where the hell are the judges on these sentencing? Okay, the judge has to follow what the jury says, or if there's a conviction, that can't the judge put these people on probation in these cases and say? Well,
there are sentencing guidelines, as you know.
Are they mandatory?
But they're not mandatory. Scalia made sure of that, and I forgot the name of the case. But you know, even if you use the guidelines, the federal sentencing guidelines, there's discretion within them, and I mean, I don't know. It baffles me. The worst thing was not that David McNabb and the two Alabamians were convicted. That was bad enough. But the worst thing was, you know, at least the local judge, and, you know, again, there's a jury here. So, you know, the judge isn't you know, finding the guy's guilty, the jury is, and so whatever happened, the jury found him guilty. The judge imposes a sentence, then it gets to the appeals court level, and when the Honduran president and attorney general write and say that this law had long been stricken from Honduras's books. I wish I had with me.
They said that they deferred the...
Yes. There you go. We don't want to follow foreign law, and then
No.
They said it was a political question.
No. Let me find this. This is unbelievable. If I can find this. Okay, this says it was a political question doctrine, but I didn't bring my copy of the case of the story here. But what the judge basically said is, at some point, we've got to stop
finality of decisions.
Going back and forth about what the foreign law is. We've got to assume that the trial court got it right because we need finality. That's the language I was looking for. Finality of decision. So he let it stand. But, you know, by this time, it had taken so long. For some reason, the Supreme Court didn't grant cert to hear the case. So then Miguel Estrada took it to the Bush administration and asked for a pardon. Never got a response. Miguel Estrada, this isn't some random attorney. This is, you know, one of the most potent, respected, brilliant conservative attorneys in the country, and we can't even get the Bush administration to listen to it. I don't know. It's crazy. It just blows my mind. Yeah?
Well, what was the true intent behind the Justice Department's desire to seek prosecution in the lobster case?
I talked to the assistant U.S. attorney down here who handled the case. She was very nice. She's in the environmental crimes unit of the local U.S. attorney's office. They got an anonymous fax saying there had been a violation, that they were bringing in underage lobsters and therefore killing the species, and it's a terrible crime against the environment. And well, there's the law. Underage.
And it's $4 million worth of lobsters too.
Yeah. And
It's a lot.
and she just, you know, I mean, all law, no sense. And so she applied it. She thought she was protecting the environment. Even though once you start looking at the case, you realize that there was almost no environmental harm done. The U.S. Customs Agency itself had a price list that included lobster tails that short from Honduras. I tried to talk to her, and you know, I was not going to rake her over the coals, but I tried to get her to explain, well, or to say, well, did you realize that someone I would serve 8 years? She was just sort of in space. Oh, it was a good case.
When we throw out a theory on it, in the U.S. District Court, Southern District of Alabama, for 2010, the last year they had statistics for, the entire Southern District, all the judges, criminal and civil, they selected 47 juries. That doesn't mean they tried 47 cases. They have so many people working for them that when they get a good case, they got to justify their existence. And she had a good case, and she worked it up for 2 years, probably.
Let me ask you this.
By the way, I tried 40 years myself, and and by the way, it's always good to quote St. Augustine, but he termed it libido dominandi, the desire of others, the government particularly, to dominate others. And I think that's what we've got going, whether it's the war on drugs, whether it's the war on terror, whatever it is, but it's this massive expansion of the government to dominate the citizenry. And, you know, it's gone a lot farther than people realize.
You're absolutely right.
You got the NSA complex opening in Utah next year. You got the drone flights. I never thought I would believe I would see what I see at the airport now. With the frisking, when the magnetometers were okay, one of the federal courts of appeals, they said, unlike frisking, the magnetometer cannot possibly be embarrassing, humiliating, I get the other word.
Intrusive.
So, yeah, intrusive. And yet, look what we've gone to. Strictly.
There was a
You're
great
absolutely
article.
right. I love that. The dominating.
Yes, it's the lust to dominate.
And again, I'm all for prosecutors.
But money allows that to happen. You cut off the money and then
I'm all for prosecutors. I'm all for judges doing their jobs. I'm all for enforcing the law. But
let me wait through it up here. When I started practicing law, but I know what he did. You had the U.S. courts, you had the U.S. Attorney's Office, and the FBI all in the federal building. Now the FBI's building is bigger than the federal building itself. I mean, what's wrong with that?
you're right. Yeah.
Along those lines that Judge Johnson was discussing with the TSA, which I think is probably one of the most glaring examples of what's going on. It's a great article in the Wall Street Journal from the ex-TSA administrator stating basically that what they do has very little benefit. That it is amazing amount of power that not only the TSA has, but a stewardess, male or female, has on an airplane. That it is an amazing amount of power that has been given to them out of basically fear, and that none of it makes sense, or none of it really equates to making us safe. And it makes me wonder, and maybe this can segue to your opinion with respect to Eric Holder. I mean, is this by design or intent, or maybe kind of like you alluded with the lobster case, that it's the beast run amok, that it's a machine we started and we can't stop? I can't make up my mind which it is.
My opinion is it's sort of the beast run amok until the last 4 years, in which case it's been more by design. And I hate to say it, but I have seen enough from the people running this Justice Department to think that they're all about domination, but that's personal opinion. Let me cite a quote here from another column of mine that I called Ninja Bureaucrats on the Loose. In a booklet called, also by Brian Walsh of the Heritage Foundation and Tiffany Jocelyn of the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, they published a booklet called Without Intent: How Congress is Eroding the Criminal Intent Requirement in Federal Law. They did an exhaustive study of nonviolent criminal offenses introduced in a recent Congress. They found that over 57% of the offenses considered by the 109th Congress contained inadequate mens rea requirements. And of those proposals actually enacted into law, 63.9% of them lacked appropriate protections. 64% of laws that impose new federal criminal penalties lack ordinary mens rea requirements.
But they get their Miranda rights.
What happened to the idea you have to have a guilty mind, that you have to have intent? It's an outrage. Anyway, I sort of went off topic there, but I remembered those stats, and I kind of put that in. Yeah.
Who was the judge in the lobster case?
I think it was Judge Ballmer, if I'm not mistaken. I was hoping his son would join us.
I think it was. What I wish I remembered is the name of the judge on the 11th Circuit, because that's where I think it just really went off the rails when they even ignored the fact that this didn't even violate Honduran law, that it had all been a mistake in the first place, a mistaken reading of a defunct part of the Honduran code. That's where I think it just really.
And that wasn't brought up at the trial phase?
No, they didn't realize it until once the guy went to jail. You know, he had a pretty good local attorney, but the attorney was assuming that the U.S. prosecutor showed him the code. He was assuming that was the Honduran code, and he was arguing on other grounds. And then when it went to appeal, Miguel Estrada, who is from Honduras, he speaks the language, he's familiar with his country of origin's criminal code, and he said something doesn't look right, and he got in touch with them, and they said, no, this isn't the law anymore. So even then, oh well, you've got to have finality sometimes. So thanks, guys. It was such an abuse of justice, it blows my mind. Anybody else?
We were talking about this well-intended citizens again. We had it recently happen in the last year, which frankly, I guess I'll disqualify myself from any cases. The governor sent out, and I got a copy of the executive order, we authorize all law enforcement agents to seize all spice found within the state of Alabama. There was no citation to any law. There was no citation to any constitutional provision. Now, after the fact, the Forces and Pharmaceutical Act were amended to say spice was a controlled substance. But the Fifth Amendment, people's rights, about having the property taken without due process, they probably just take it. And that, they weren't even, I mean, he was mentioned in the newspapers and the press as if it was a great thing, and nobody mentioned that there may be a problem with it.
Well,
And
that was done by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. I don't know what's the matter with it.
That was done executive order.
Well, they didn't think it was illegally done to the government.
Oh, well, there you go. You're exactly right. You're exactly right.
I really urge y'all, if y'all are interested, to read this book, again, to which I contributed just the one chapter, but,
Really is good.
the case of the elderly orchid,
I
enthusiast.
saw that on television. I can't remember, there was a SWAT team from the Department of Agriculture knocking the old man and woman down. And he finally had to plead and take 6 years because they went bankrupt. They were raising orchids and it apparently imported the wrong seeds or something. That was really probably the worst.
Yeah, and in this case, this is a man who knew he was, that when you're importing stuff, again, the Lacey Act applies foreign environmental laws to the U.S., and he knew he was supposed to fill out the forms, but he got sloppy with it. Retired old couple, and he didn't fill them out in triplicate or something. I mean, it was clear that he had tried to do it right, but had gotten confused. I mean, there was no mass conspiracy. This man in jail, he had diabetes. He was like 77 years old, and he had a stroke while he was in jail. He gets out finally years later, and his life is gone. It's horrible.
Would you give us some examples briefly of what you believe the Holder Justice Department is doing with the...
Yeah. On this front, I don't have a lot of new evidence on over-criminalization other than stuff that y'all have reported on. My observation, though, is on other fronts from the Holder Justice Department. Thank you. Where they're an absolutely lawless bunch. I urge everybody to read and to get, for all of your law partners, a book by Justice Department whistleblower named J. Christian Adams. The book is called Injustice, and it's got a subhead, something about the racial something of the Holder Justice Department.
That was when they blew the whistle on the Black Panther group.
And
Pretty little guy.
there were two whistleblowers, Christian Adams and Chris Coates. Chris Coates is a pretty liberal guy, long-time civil rights attorney, won all sorts of civil rights awards. Now, Christian Adams is a conservative who has also won awards, for instance, for protecting the civil rights of black voters in the South Carolina district. He reveres Martin Luther King, but he's otherwise politically conservative. And they were the two that blew the whistle on this Black Panther case, which, by the way, I was the first person in print to report that case had been dropped. That was my story that I wrote. But read this book. It reads like a well-written legal brief, except more entertaining. But names, dates, facts, citations, court cases, witnesses, everything, like a really good legal brief, and nobody in the Justice Department has refuted or even tried to refute a single fact in the book. And he talks about, it's especially bad with the Civil Rights Division. That's what he's mostly writing on. How they want to enforce the law against Democrats, they won't enforce the law against if the perpetrators are black and the victims are white. They won't enforce voting rights law. There's a provision in the motor voter law which greatly expanded, the motor voter law, of course, greatly expanded the ability of people to register to vote. But I was there when that was passed. I was in Congress, and my boss, Bob Livingston, was spearheading the Republican side of it. And the Republican side of it says if you're going to pass this law, at least put in certain protections against vote fraud, require the states to, every couple of years, go through its and purge the rolls of dead people and of convicted felons, if the state makes convicted felons ineligible to vote, and of people who have moved away. The one anti-fraud provision in this bill. Julie Fernandez, the deputy chief of the Civil Rights Division, it's a brown bag lunch for the entire division, and she says, we're not going to enforce that section, I think it was section 5 of the Motor Voter Act. That does nothing to improve our turnout. Cited by several people in sworn testimony before the U.S. Civil Rights Commission, sworn testimony, never refuted by the Justice Department. They couldn't refute it because she said this in a meeting where dozens and dozens of people were there. And if dozens and dozens of people were called up under oath, they would have to say, yes, she said that. Silence from the Justice Department because they know she said it. That's just one of the please read Injustice by J. Christian Adams. It will turn your, it will curl your hair. He talks about the voting rights cases in Hale County and Perry County here in Alabama, and about how the Civil Rights Division attorney who came down here with him on the way down said, can you believe we're going down to Alabama to enforce voting rights against black people on the to the benefit of whites? And he says, I don't want any part of this, the guy said to Christian Adams, and then proceeded to do everything he could to paper over the case. I mean, you all have heard of the convictions up in Hale and Perry County. So, anyway, enough on that. Anybody else?
On that same subject, when in the 94 election, I guess it was, and being careful not to intimidate voters, we had 2 investigators in a van in Marion, Alabama at one of the polls, and it was pretty obvious that they were swapping a vote for a rock or crack, and you give them the I vote sticker. And when we turned this over to the, it was pretty, it was always young men, young black men, and they came with the I voted sticker and someone put their hand. And before we set up our meeting with he was with me, I won't mention names, with the appropriate officials, before they would look at our tape, it was, what color are they? It's what difference does that make? That's the first thing that came out of my mouth.
Here's the best example. The administration, after 2.5 years, finally had to back off of this one because I kept writing about it, and several others, especially at Heritage, kept writing about it, and so it encouraged the people to challenge what the Justice Department was doing, and the Justice Department realized they were about to lose the case, so they finally withdrew the case. But Kinston, North Carolina, black majority town, wanted to do what 95% of the townships in North Carolina did, which is move from partisan elections to nonpartisan elections. Covered by section, section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, had to get pre-clearance from the Justice Department. Justice Department said, you can't do this. Okay, it had gone to a referendum black majority town voted to go to nonpartisan elections. In the black majority precincts, a majority of the black voters voted to move to nonpartisan elections. Justice Department said, in effect, we're not going to let you move to to nonpartisan elections, because then it will keep the black citizens of Kinston from being able to elect, quote, candidates of choice, because they would not be able to elect candidates of choice if they didn't know that the candidates were Democrats. So they were telling the black residents of Kinston who wanted nonpartisan elections that they were too stupid to know what was in their own best interest. Because it wasn't about black or white, it was actually about getting more Democrats elected. And the candidates of choice couldn't be identified as candidates of choice. They wrote this unless they were identified as Democrats. As I said, after 2.5 years, all of a sudden, letter comes from Tom Perez, head of the Civil Rights Division, finding some excuse. We are withdrawing our objection to the nonpartisan elections. Took 2.5 years.
Probably have the right lawyer then, Holder's old law firm.
Anyway, there you go.
Yeah, Quinn, one more comment. Somebody made or asked the question, why didn't the judge do something? I've been in those positions many times where the machinery keeps going. But I'll tell you one story. I don't want to go into the whole facts and that, and they worked with me then, but there was a woman who, in Mississippi, tried for attempted murder along with her son of her ex-husband who had been molesting her daughter, but that's all stuff. But first of all, when I found out the son was being tried to, and he was youthful offender eligible, when I found out the reason for it, retribution for the molestation, I gave him a youthful offender, by the way. But she was convicted, mainly because she had a sorry lawyer, and at sentencing, I'd taken her in custody, I thought, this is wrong. And so I gave her probation, the DA, that's an illegal sentence. I said, just take it to Montgomery, and nobody did anything about it. But, you know, it takes something in you to go against the grain when the whole machinery is running there. And it was all done by the book. Yeah. But it was a wrong outcome.
And that's what happens.
Yeah, it does. You're just doing it like you're supposed to do.
And there's got to be a way to stop it.
Yeah,
I know. It takes courage, like Judge Johnson. You know, a lot of the Nazi officers, well, I was just loading people on train. I wasn't showing them, I was just doing my job. And then there's a lot of
Brian, that's the perfect point. I never could understand. Why would the Jews get in boxcars or sometimes in the trenches to be machine gunned? Why are we lining up to be strip searched? It's incrementalism.
It is. Anyway, it's a problem. Anything y'all can do to help get the word out and combat it, I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much.